So where to begin is actually a very difficult question. And I actually want to begin at the French Revolution, which is really the beginning of modernity for the Jewish people. Now, the French Revolution is incredibly important in Jewish history because before that, Jews didn't belong in society. And suddenly the French Revolution rolls around, early 1800s, you've got Napoleon in power, and Napoleon gathers a group of elders together, and he's trying to decide, he's just decided, or at least France has decided, that there's going to be this thing called the citizen. In fact, Simon Schama, who's a really important historian, that's actually the name of his book, The History of the French Revolution, is called Citizen. And the question he's asking is, are Jews going to be allowed to be citizens? And so he gathers these elders together and he asks a series of questions. They're called the Sanhedrin, these elders. And the questions range from, for example, when French law and Jewish law disagree, which one is going to win? It's, would you fight in the French army? And basically, these Jewish elders knock it out of the park. They say everything correct except for one question, which is, would you marry a French Christian woman? Where they kind of punt on that because it's the early 1800s and they're not quite ready to embrace intermarriage yet. But basically, from that moment, Jews enter into society. And Jacob Katz, who's a very famous historian from Colombia, says that Jews didn't walk, they ran out of the ghetto. And they entered in with gusto into society. Now, the French Revolution kind of spread. Ironically, Jews had their rights a little bit before in America, but there weren't enough of them to really count in terms of the significance of Jewish history. But it moved to Germany and it moved to other places in Western Europe. And so France, the bastion of this Jewish belonging, had a lot on the line when suddenly France slipped into anti-Semitism. And the kind of turning point for France was this thing called the Dreyfus Affair. Now, if you know about it, Alfred Dreyfus works in the French army, and he ends up with trumped-up charges, being brought up. And there's a budding journalist who is covering his trial, which brings out the worst in French society, such anti-Semitism. And that person's name was Theodor Herzl. And Herzl's looking around at this anti-Semitism. He's looking around at the fact that this guy who seemed to have made it in France of all places, the most modern place where Jews could possibly belong, if he is in trouble, then all Jews are in trouble. And so Herzl births this idea, which is called Zionism. Now, I want to say Herzl wasn't the first one to say that we should have a state for the Jews. He wasn't the first one to say that Israel matters. There were proto-Zionists, people before him way back, right? If you've ever read, for example, of George Eliot's Daniel Deronda, that's way before we're talking the late 1800s. And you find there's like Zionist voices in there too, right? But Herzl was the most important of those voices, and he created a movement called political Zionism, where he gathered people together in Basel, and you can find it on your sheet, the first Zionist Congress in 1897, and basically said to them, we need a state for the Jews. And he was animated primarily by two different factors. The first is wherever Jews go, they will always find anti-Semitism. So you need a safe haven for the Jewish people so they can gather together and some place that's going to help Jews if they are in trouble. Number one. But number two, you have to remember what's going on at the time. There was this hot new thing called nationalism, which was all the rage. And what is nationalism? Nationalism is intense pride in your particular kind of people tied to a land. And he looks around and he says, just as the French have France and just as the Germans have Germany, Jews need Jewland. And so he goes looking for that. Now, if you're curious if that is something that is still in play, I have to tell you that when I was a kid, I actually did a project, I remember in middle school, where I needed to present on the, quote, place where my family was from. So I picked Poland, right? And so I ended up with a problem Because my family wasn't eating kielbasa when I was talking about the food of Poland, right? That wasn't kosher. My family wasn't dancing the polka. They were listening to klezmer music. There was something about living in those places, but being other in the fact that he was never going to be French or he was never going to be German. And this guy, Theodor Herzl, grew up in Bavaria, hearing all about, you know what, our ancestors was the one who sacked Rome. And he's thinking to himself, no, my ancestors were living in Babylonia writing the Talmud at the time that your ancestors sacked Rome. And so he, through those two things, anti-Semitism and the need for nationalism, ends up going looking for a place for the Jews. And he's, by the way, willing to entertain any place possible. He'll go to Uganda. He'll go to places in Alaska. He'll be okay with Madagascar. There's all these places all bandied about for where he could possibly end up. But there were other voices in the room at the time saying, no, 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 we have to be in the land of Israel. And what's interesting, by the way, is there were lots of different kinds of Zionisms floating around. For Herzl, it was all about the safe haven and the nationalism. But there were a group of Zionists who were living mostly in the Pale of Settlement, which is Eastern Europe, who said to themselves, there's this hot new thing in our world too, and it's called socialism. And we want to create a place in Israel which is going to be the socialist haven, where we can go and we can remake who the Jew is. For them, when they pictured a Jew, they thought of this kind of skinny, wizened, like short, very pale-skinned, studying all day kind of person. And what they wanted is someone who could make the desert bloom, who was tall, who was strapping, who was tan, who could live out the socialist dream of the farmer. And so they then said, we need to be in Israel and we need to be able to do that. By the way, these guys are the ones who created the kibbutz movement, right? They were some of the earliest of the settlers. But then there were other voices like a guy named Ahad Ha'am who said, no, no, no. Israel should be for us a cultural hub where the best Jewish art and music and dance are from. And then someone else, Zev Jabotinsky, comes along. These guys are all in the proverbial room together. They may not have actually been in that particular room, but they're in the proverbial room at the time. And he's saying to himself, we need to remake the Jewish narrative, where once upon a time, Jews were weak and were killed. We need a place where Jews can finally be strong. Our narrative will no longer be, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. The narrative of the Jewish people will be, they tried to kill us, we fought back, and we won. And so all of those different voices are in the room. And by the way, if you look at modern Israel, Israel's a product of all of those different voices, right? It's got the Jewish national majority and the Jewish government, just like Herzl would want. It's got the amazing Jewish culture and the rebirth of Hebrew in the Jewish language. It has the army, and then it is the only place on earth where somehow in the year 1900 and the year 2000 has more trees in that country than the year 1900 did. The only country in the world. So that kind of socialist need to farm and change the land actually did work. And so all of these people start talking, and there begins to be wave upon wave of people moving to Israel, trying to, make a home for themselves. The first Aliyah, which isn't even on your sheet, it's right around then, the convention, kind of fails. It's a little bit like the New World, like, those first wave of people who entered into the New World. For the most part, they kind of died of starvation and disease, and many of them went home. That's kind of what happened with the first waves of people who entered Israel. But people really hit their stride around 1904 with this second Aliyah. Now, 1904 corresponded around then to some of the worst pogroms that the Jews were facing, the worst of which was called the Kishinev Massacre, which basically a group of Cossacks came in and completely leveled Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. And there are very famous poetry written about it, a poem called The City of Slaughter by Chaim Nachman Bialik, he's the kind of poet laureate of the beginning of Israel, where he talked about his disgust with the fact that men are cowering underneath tables as this is happening. And when they come out after their wives have been violated, their chief question to their rabbi is, can I still sleep with them again? I mean, there was such disgust with this old world Jewry and the way that it interacted with this world around them, that it started sending waves and waves over to Israel very early, well before the Holocaust. We're talking the early 1900s here. Now, when they came over, there was a little bit of a misnomer. The line that most people quoted when they walked over was, we are going to go settle a land without a people for a people without a land, which is not actually fair and not actually true. There were people living on that land. And there's a famous book, I actually sent it out to you in the lists of books, which is called My Promised Land, where kind of the refrain of the beginning of that book is my grandfather came over to settle Israel, and he just didn't see them. He just didn't see them. Now, that's not necessarily true. Jews and Arabs at the beginning coexisted. But when you hear the refrain that Jews came and they stole the land, that's not actually true in that sense. There are primarily three ways that Jews dealt with the land when they got to Israel. And stealing the land was not really one of them. Number one, those early socialist Zionists were committed to going to places where people didn't live and changing the landscape around them. So for example, they planted eucalyptus trees in the middle of swamps. Eucalyptus trees notoriously suck up the water around them. They dried up the swamps, and then they used that land and they farmed on that land, number one. Number two, they bought vacant land and they used that land for farming. Now, I want to point out that the majority of Arab farmers living, or ranchers living at that time, did actually just kind of, they were nomads that were bringing their sheep and their herds around. So that did cause a little bit of controversy, because although that land wasn't theirs, some of them had been using that land in order to feed their animals for a while. The third thing that Jews primarily did when they got there was that they purchased the land. But much of the land in Palestine at the time was, or really the Ottoman Empire at the time, was owned by absentee landlords who were living in Turkey. And the people who were kind of farming on that land were kind of designated squatters called fellahin, right? They kept the land fertile, and but it wasn't theirs, it was the landlords. And so Jews did actually do the research, figure out who the landlords were, mostly go to Istanbul, purchase the land from them, come back with the deed to the land, and often actually leave the farmers to still do it, but just they were the ones to take the cut. Though there were occasionally times where they did say to them, I'm really sorry, we now have the deed, this is now our land. But never did they come and forcefully, there are really not accounts of them coming and forcefully making these Ottoman Arabs at the time leave. So history progresses and World War I rolls around. And as we know, the Ottomans, who are in charge of what we know now as Israel, eventually lose World War I. And you should know, by the way, that during the time when World War I is beginning to end, there are multiple promises that are being made, both to the Palestinians and to the Jews, by the West. If you take one thing away from the pre-state period, it's that the West, specifically England and France, really messed a lot of stuff up. And one of the things that they did was that they were decentralized. So some people wrote letters and made promises to the Arabs, and some people wrote letters and made promises to the Jews. The most famous promise to the Jews is called the Balfour Declaration. It was, it's 1917, and it was a promise to basically establish a Jewish state in Palestine. But pretty earlier, actually, was a series of letters, which you can find, which is called the Hussein Mahmoud letters. And what those letters are is it's a promise on the part of the British to the Arab League who is there to say to themselves, look, we know that you feel disillusioned with the Turks. You're living in the Middle East. You've got a completely different culture than theirs. You don't want to be part of them anymore. So help us fight them and win this war, and we will give you the land that we win in the war. That's what these letters essentially say. Now, later, when they're confronted about it, what they say is like, we don't mean all the land, we meant a lot of the land. So we're going to give you, for example, Jordan, and we're going to give you Syria. But we didn't actually mean Palestine. But that's not the way that the Arabs who were living in Palestine felt about those particular letters. The letters are sufficiently vague, and that's one of the grievances that they end up having. And so the wars end up getting fought, right? And by the way, you may know the phenomenon I just talked about if you've ever seen Lawrence of Arabia, right? So the wars end up getting fought, and toward the end of World War I, a group of people get together and create really two leaders, one from France and one from England, and they end up carving up the Middle East. And the way that we know these borders primarily is because of what's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is the carving up of the Middle East. Now, they didn't do a particularly good job as they carved up the Middle East, mostly because they didn't think of the people who were living there. Instead, they mostly used geography. And so they said, you know what, this river would be a great border, and this mountain range would be a great border. We're going to draw a circle around that and call that Iraq. We're going to put some Sunnis and some Shiites and some Kurds together in one place, and we're just going to hope for the best, which is part of the reason the Middle East is a little challenging right now. But they did that. And they end up with this place, which we call Palestine, and the League of Nations in 1922 gives it to England and basically gives them the mandate, that's why it's called the British Mandate, to say, you know, do with this as you wish and maybe transition it into an independent state one day, right? And that becomes what is going to happen from the end of World War I up through, the British Mandate continues through 1948. Now, things start getting really dicey during the British Mandate period. And there begins to be a series of uprisings. And the way to understand this period, and we won't go into every uprising and every response to that uprising, is basically immigration starts coming. Arabs who are living at the time start feeling like their way of life is threatened. Maybe it's because, you know, one particular place where they used to have their cattle go is no longer theirs anymore, or any other reasons. And there begins to be kind of uprisings. And then the British start reconsidering whether or not Jews should be immigrating anymore. And then the Jews push back and they loosen and they allow more Jewish immigration during that time. And then there begins to be another uprising. And there's two famous uprisings, you know, of the little ones that happen. One is in 1929. Ironically, actually, it is because someone tried to put a mechitza in the Western Wall. Now, that shouldn't seem like that should be like the reason for the Hebron massacre of 1929. But the reason is because the Western Wall complex is so incredibly important to both Jews and to Arabs that by 1929, there was actually an agreement that said no one touches this thing. And so when Jews tried to make the change and they actually separated men and women for the Western Wall, that was enough to trigger the 1929 Hebron massacre, or the Arab uprising. There are also major uprisings in the 1930s, specifically 1936 to 1939. Those were big. So what happens is the British start publishing what's called white papers, which essentially limit the immigration that Jews are having. And Jews start sneaking into Israel illegally, and it's called the Aliyah Bet. It's the illegal immigration that Jews end up entering into at the time, because they, especially toward the 1930s, are realizing they have nowhere else to go. Nazi Germany is rising. It is getting unsafe for Jews. The only place they can begin to travel is Israel. And so even once World War II starts happening, it's actually really interesting, because the Jews start fighting the lack of a better word, occupiers, right? They start fighting the British and trying to get the British to either change their policies or to leave. Most notably, a group of people end up actually blowing up the King David Hotel, which is where the British are, to try to convince the British that it's time to go. And so there's this interesting dance that the Jews are doing, especially during World War II, where they say, and this is a quote from David Ben-Gurion, who becomes the first prime minister of Israel, we're going to fight the Nazis as if there is no white paper, and we are going to fight the white paper as if there is no Nazis. Meaning, We're going to cooperate with the British to help the British fight the Nazis. We're going to create Jewish paratrooper units. You might have heard of Hannah Senesh, who's a Jewish poet from Palestine, who ends up behind enemy lines. And we have her poetry, but she ends up dying, right? And at the same time, we are not going to stop blowing up train tracks and sabotaging things from the British to convince the British to let us increase our lifeline for the Jews. Because at the same time that the British are trying to turn people away from coming to Israel, America's also turning away the spirit of St. Louis, which is, a really important part of American Jewish history, that America wouldn't let in these Jewish immigrants who were trying to leave Nazi Germany, only to have that turn around and a huge percentage of the people on that boat end up dying back in Europe again. And so Jews are realizing that it's getting dicey and it's scary. And so they say to themselves, okay, we've got to do something. And it gets heated and worse and harder, and there's still infighting among the Jewish community. Now, the West is realizing, by the way, that they need to do something. So in 1937, they create what's called the Peel Commission, which basically is the first time that a group of people decide that they need to, quote unquote, partition Israel. They need a place for Arabs to go and a place for Jews to go. And that then sets the stage for after the Holocaust, when there are tons of Jewish refugees, and many of them are clamoring to come to Israel, for the UN to take up the mantle and actually do a, quote unquote, partition plan. And so they create this. This is what Israel was supposed to be. In 1947, November 29th of 1947, they pass a plan that's going to make Israel and Palestine, right? A Jewish state and a Palestinian state. And the Palestinian state is all of what you see in yellow. The Jewish state is all of what you see in blue. And they primarily drew it based around where the majority populations were. So if an area had more Arabs, it was going to be the Arab state. If it had more Jews, it was going to be the Jewish state. But there was still going to be an Arab minority here and a Jewish minority there, and they weren't going to really kind of bus people or force them away. And so this passes in 1947. And immediately upon passing, Israel finds itself, or at least the Jews find themselves, in a civil war. That their Palestinian neighbors have created an uprising because they will not accept this. And that continues until May of 1948, when Israel declares independence. They publish a Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, is at this point the only formal document. There is no constitution in Israel. They've not been able to pass one yet. And they get attacked by 5 nations. They get attacked by Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. And overnight, Israel is fighting for its life. Now, they eventually win that war in the Armistice Agreement of 1949. But the big thing about this, and by the way, when it ends, it looks like this. This is Israel. This is Egypt. And this is called the Gaza Strip. It's Egypt. And this West Bank, and it's called the West Bank because it's the West Bank of the Jordan River, is Jordan. Okay? There is no Palestinian state. It is Egypt and Jordan. But I want to point out that when the dust settles, what we do know, and this is a really important part of the history to understand what's going on here, is that 700,000 Arabs who used to live in Israel, or who used to live in a home somewhere in Israel, now live in a different home, either somewhere in Israel or somewhere else. And you can see this is the list of the Arab refugees. So this is the group of people who have formally registered as refugees after after the Independence War. Now, the question of what is a refugee is an important question. Is it just those 700,000 people, or is it their children? Is it their grandchildren? Or in this case, is it their great-grandchildren? Because it's been a lot of generations. But some of them live in the West Bank and Gaza, but point to their homes somewhere else in Israel. Others live in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, America. You can be a Palestinian refugee almost anywhere in the world. And so if you listen to the Daily, and I recommend if anybody, like everybody should, because it was amazing, from the New York Times, you know that it's complicated about what makes that refugee problem. And essentially, there is truth to a Jewish narrative and to a Palestinian narrative. The Jewish narrative says, look, we were attacked, we're fighting for our lives, and over the radio, the Arab armies, right, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, tells people, why don't you leave so you don't get caught in the crossfire, and when we win, you can come back home. Then, the other narrative, which is the Palestinian narrative, is Jews marched into places we live and forcefully made us leave. And by the way, Israel didn't really come to terms with that truth in history until around like the 90s. And at that point, a new crop of Israeli historians called the New Historians, and Betty Morris is the most famous of those historians, start actually looking at documentation and saying to themselves, like, oh yeah, I guess you're right. Like Lod, which was called Lida back then, like there was actually a forced migration, and there was a massacre in a place called Deir Yassin, and that did happen, right? And then there's the third, which is that Arabs were scared away, but they were not made to leave. And so there's famous stories, for example, of Svat, which is in the north, where the Jews had a certain kind of gun that they were fighting the Arabs with that didn't do very much, but it was really, really loud. And they fired that gun, and at the same time, it started raining, and it was the middle of the summer. And if you know anything about Israel, it does not rain in the summer ever. It's a Mediterranean climate. It stops raining around Passover and picks up again around Sukkot. And because they heard a loud noise and saw rain, and there was this new thing they had heard about called a nuclear weapon, where they knew about this thing called nuclear rain, they thought that they had fired a nuclear weapon and fled and left. So there are three ways that Palestinians ended up not in their homes at the time. And it's hard to know exactly which of those ways any given population is. But if you read different accounts, you're going to find that there are different answers to those particular questions. I do want to say Israel was fighting for their lives. They were fighting a defensive civil war and a defensive war against those five nations. And so there are times where you do, in a war, have to do ugly things, like clear populations out because they're about to threaten your civilians, for example. And so war is challenging. But their legacy of being made to leave your home, I would say, is the fundamental legacy that Palestinians are carrying with them. In fact, Palestinians actually often will hand down keys like from that original house to their children. And so people will still, many generations later, have the original key to the house that they lived in 1948. It's almost like a religious experience of the refugee. At the same time, Jews are incredibly triggered by the legacy of having so many nations kind of attack them at once, and at the same time dealing with the fact that they were fighting civil wars against their neighbors. It's incredibly triggering, right? Right, and the legacy after the Holocaust, it felt to the Jewish people like another Holocaust was going to be thrust upon them. And so war is horrible. We're watching war right now, and 48 was no different than that. And so history is written depending on what your perspective is, and the truth lies somewhere in between the they left on their own accord and we kicked them out account. Everybody following this? All right. How am I doing on time? All right, I think I'm okay. I'm holding your attention? All right. So now we're in the period after 1949. And at this point, as soon as Israel becomes a country, and this is an incredibly important piece that I'm talking about just now, that lots of people don't take into account. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews in the Arab world. Jews in Iraq, Jews in Tunisia, Jews in Morocco. And overnight, those Jews found themselves as refugees again. And Israel made room for them, and they brought them in. And so right now, there are countries that used to have huge Jewish populations that basically have no Jews anymore. They found their way to Israel, and Israel changed its demographic. Whereas before, right, pre-1949, 1950, the majority of Jews who came in were Europeans. Suddenly the makeup of Jews are different. Israel is not a country of white people because more than 50% of Israel's population is actually the refugees and the children of the refugees from that time period when Jews were made to leave after Israel becomes a country. And so they enter into Israel, and what's interesting is that many of them end up being made to settle parts of Israel that were just under and are still under attack. And so imagine you come on to Israel, you enter into the airport or to the port in Haifa, and there are two vans. One says Tel Aviv and one says Jerusalem. And you talk among your family and you decide where you're going to go, and you enter into one of those vans and they drive around until it grows dark into circles, and they drop you off in the middle of the desert right next to the Gaza border. And so it's interesting to note that many of those kibbutzim, many of those towns that were around what's called the Gaza envelope, which were the places that were attacked on the 7th of October, are actually Arab places, Jewish Arab places that began in 1949, 1950. And so the interwar period found Israel kind of fighting a couple different wars. The most famous of them was called the Sinai Campaign. I'm just going to say a word about that because it's, of all the wars, it's the least important for our purposes. But it's important insofar as Israel was not a worldwide power yet. In fact, in 1948, when they were fighting the War of Independence, they got most of their weapons from Czechoslovakia. America wasn't even really helping so much at that point. But what happens is France and England are having problems with Egypt, and they basically use Israel as a proxy to fight Egypt on their behalf. And that becomes the first real awakening of Israel and the West. And so eventually Egypt catches on and realizes what's going on, that they're actually fighting a proxy war that Israel is doing with the West. But that becomes important because Israel is starting to creep into authenticity in the same way now that Israel is kind of a beacon of the West in kind of the 21st century. It takes a little while to get there, and that happens around, right after the War of Independence. In addition to that, you begin to find the wakings up of kind of the Arab nationalist movement, especially the PLO, which starts in 1964. Now, I want to say a word about Palestinians and who a Palestinian is. Because one of the ways that people often talk about Palestinians, which is incredibly offensive, and I hope we don't do this, is that people will call Palestinians an invented people. I want to explain where that comes from and why that's not fair. You should know, by the way, that most people are quote unquote invented people when they are nascent, when they are new, right? Christians were invented people when Jesus first died, and Muslims were invented people at the time of Muhammad. Like, any group is allowed to form at any time. And so, you can have communities. Benedict Anderson, who's a famous anthropologist, says that all communities are imagined, right? And so, yes, there was a kind of Arab nationalism that superseded this particular land at the time when they were under Ottoman control. But there's a historian whose name is Khalidi, right? And if you should definitely read books by Jewish authors on the history of Israel. But if you're looking for like the best scholarly book by a Palestinian author told from a Palestinian perspective, Khalidi is your guy. He's out of I think Colombia. And so he talks about the fact that for the most part there was a sense of a peoplehood of Palestinians living here, mostly because they were tied to Jerusalem. Now, why is Jerusalem important for all Arabs, but specifically Palestinians, being we are the people who live near Jerusalem? Well, for Jews, we know Jerusalem was the place where we had our first temple, our second temple. It's the place where King David was, right? Jerusalem was the place supposedly right near where Abraham brought Isaac up to sacrifice him, Mount Moriah being right there. And so Israel is incredibly important to Jews, but to Palestinians, It's the third most important Muslim place. First being Mecca, second being Medina, third being Jerusalem. And it's important because Muhammad supposedly hops on a horse that jumps and kind of flies to Jerusalem. He ties the horse up at the Western Wall, and then he goes to a place on top of the Temple Mount, which becomes the Al-Aqsa Mosque. By the way, there are two mosques on the Temple Mount. One is Al-Aqsa, one is Dome of the Rock. Dome of the Rock's prettier, but less important for Muslims. Al-Aqsa is the important one. And rises up to heaven there, where he argues God down from like praying like 40 times a day to praying 5 times a day. And that's why Muslims have the prayer that they do. And so that becomes incredibly important. And so what happens is there begins to be this movement of coalescing. As soon as the British Mandate happens and the borders come around, you find that the Palestinians end up beginning to coalesce into a people. Now, the partition was 1922. By the 1960s, so 40 years later, they have coalesced into a national identity, and they begin to do terrorist acts against the Jewish community here, and also, honestly, against Jordanian occupiers and things like that. Now, in 1967, Israel ends up fighting a war that's called the Six-Day War. That might be the most consequential war besides the War of Independence that Israel fights. Now, Israel fights a war that is actually a defensive war, though they fire the first shot, okay? What happens is the Straits of Tiran, which is right down here, right? And it's super important because without those straits, right? If you're going to trade with India, you would have to go around the Horn of Africa, all the way around, because you're definitely not using the Suez Canal if you're Israel, right? All the way around to the Straits of Gibraltar and into Haifa. That's where the deep sea port is. But there's another deep sea port in Eilat. And so closing that strait was an act of war. In addition to that, Israel's watching as the different armies are lining up along those borders, saying, we are going to push you into the sea. We're going to wipe you out. And Israel ends up attacking. First, they fly their planes super low underneath the radars, and they wipe out the whole Egyptian Air Force. And from there, the other armies were basically sitting ducks. And within 6 days, Israel becomes what Gershon Gorenberg, who's a really important Jewish historian, calls the accidental empire. They suddenly own up here, which is called the Golan Heights. They own this area right here, which is called the West Bank. They own the Gaza Strip, okay? And they own Sinai also. And the UN publishes Resolution 242, which basically says to the Jewish people, or to Israel, give everything back you just took. Now, the UN does that a lot. Israel doesn't listen to the UN, but it's interesting. How did Israel go from not trusting the UN? If you ask an average Israeli, what do you think about the UN? They'll spit, right? The UN is not Israel's friend. How do they go from 1947, creating Israel, till then? A series of major missteps. One being, for example, fighting a defensive war in 67 and being told to give everything back you just took. Another in the mid-70s, where a resolution gets passed that essentially says Zionism is inherently racist. And that lasts until the 90s before it's repealed, right? And on until you find that there are pockets of the UN who, for example, will whitewash Jewish history in Israel, even though you can't dig anywhere without running into some kind of Jewish ruin, right? And so Israel does not give that back. And instead, there becomes a policy, which is a policy of what's called settlement. And that begins, especially when Israel turns more right-wing. So after 67, you find that the next major war is in 73. That's the Yom Kippur War, where Israel is again attacked, surprised by all of these different nations. And it was the first time, by the way, that Jews around the world kind of hung their heads a little low and said, we're like a little bit ashamed of what we just saw, right? 48 was huge. It was a victory. 67 was huge. It was a victory. 73, we look weak. We look unprepared. We kind of are losing until finally, at the very kind of last minute, we end up gaining ground and winning that war and winning back what's taken from us. The Yom Kippur War was an embarrassment for the Jewish people. So take that, and then take the fact that those Arabs who were living in Israel were feeling like they were oppressed by the kind of Ashkenazi Jews. By Arabs, I mean the Arab Jews, right? The Tunisian Jews, the Iraqi Jews. And there becomes what's called the Mahapacha, which is like the revolution, the flipping over. And Israel, whose government was left-wing from 1948 until the mid-1970s, suddenly becomes right-wing. And the first right-wing prime minister in the history of Israel was a guy whose name was Menachem Begin. Okay? And so Menachem Begin ends up here, and he's facilitating people building in here. And anytime you hear the word settlement, we are talking about places in here or here, no longer Gaza, but it was Gaza for a while before the early 2000s, where people were building essentially towns, right? And the first settlement to come in, importantly, was in the Gush sector of the West Bank. And it was important in part because I don't want you to just think the War of Independence only was dirty on one side. There was a major massacre right around here of a Jewish town where women and children were killed in the 48 war also. And that left such a mark to the Jewish community that when in 67 they were able to get the land back, that was actually the first settlements that were built in Israel was there. And from there, it kind of took off. And you found that lots and lots of people start moving. Now, why do settlements get built? Settlements get built for two reasons primarily. One reason is ideological. So if you build a settlement, it is harder to give that land back. It is ours, right? And number two, and this is more of a modern phenomenon, it is so expensive to live in a corridor from about here to here in Israel, okay? One of the most expensive places in the world. And so if you've got 5, 6 children, it's really hard to find a place to live. And so if you want to live near where the action is, not like down here, right, in the middle of the desert, you're going to get more bang for your buck up here. And so there's a lot of pressure as these families grow and to increase those settlements. You're following me? Okay. So after the Six-Day War, the Arab League doubles down, and they have a meeting in Khartoum, and they pass the 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiation with Israel. But what's interesting is that by the time that Menachem Begin comes to power, the Arab world has begun to turn. And in 1979, he actually makes peace with Anwar Sadat, who's the prime minister of Egypt, in what's called the first Camp David Accords. Hugely momentous, really important historical period, because suddenly, for the first time, Egypt, who was the big bad, they were the biggest arch enemy of the Jewish people, they were the ones who are making peace with the Jews, okay? And that then continues. Now, the next thing that happens after that is that from that period and moving forward, there's a tremendous amount of terrorist activity. People sending bombs over from Lebanon, and the PLO is causing trouble. Now, the PLO gets kicked out, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, headed by Yasser Arafat, gets kicked out of Jordan, ends up in Lebanon, eventually gets kicked out of Lebanon and ends up in Tunisia. But when they're in Lebanon, the Jewish community enters into Lebanon to fight what's called the First Lebanon War. And the whole idea is to root out the PLO. And there, by the way, are like, you have to remember, there are enclaves in Jordan and in Lebanon, that's how they ended up there, of refugee camps. Now, I want to say a word about refugee camps because you're going to have heard about this in the news. A refugee camp doesn't look like you think with a bunch of white tents from the UN. A refugee camp is a city, right? But it's a city of stateless people. And so there was something about Jordan and Lebanon that made sense to them to be keeping the Palestinians stateless. Because if the Palestinians end up becoming Lebanese or Jordanian, one, they don't want it because there's like, for lack of a better word, the Palestinians are the Jews of the Arab world, right? Nobody wants them, right? But number two, it's also, they had a vested interest in keeping the Palestinians stateless because that would make it harder for the Jews to claim what's done is done, right? If a group of people are oppressed, you're more likely to be able to turn around this Jewish state. And so the Palestinians end up with refugee camps here and here. And so the first Lebanon War ends up becoming like really horrible at times because there's tension between the PLO and the Maronite Christians who live in Lebanon, and there are enclaves of Palestinians who actually get slaughtered by the Maronite Christians during the first Lebanon War. And Israel gets in trouble, even in Israel itself. There's a famous report called the Kahan Report about this, because they turn a blind eye. The commander at the time, who eventually becomes the prime minister, Ariel Sharon, and he kind of lets this massacre happen, okay? But what happens is, in order to make sure that the border up here stays quiet, from the early 1980s until 2000, Jews are occupying this area of Lebanon. And it creates such discord that a group of people end up arising whose name is Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is a direct result of the first Lebanon War and the aftermath of the first Lebanon War. And Hezbollah, by the way, if you were to ask me who I'm more scared of, I am much more scared of Hezbollah than I am of Hamas. Hezbollah has somewhere in the vein right now about 150,000 rockets aimed at Israel. And so the hope is that that doesn't turn into something much more scary. So at the same time that this is happening up here, the Palestinian nationalist movement is starting to hit its stride here. And in 1987, after actually, weirdly, a car crash that kills some Palestinians, there becomes this huge uprising, which is called the First Intifada. Intifada, by the way, means it's the word that is used in Arabic, like if you've got a flea and you're a dog and you want to shake it off. That's what an intifada is. And the idea is that the Palestinians want to shake off the Jewish army that's here, right? Because this is Israel, but not Israel, and they're also making sure that the settlers who are here are safe. And so they start throwing Molotov cocktails and rocks and attacking the soldiers. And the first Intifada, as opposed to the second, doesn't spill out into Israel proper. It mostly stays here. But it's the first time the world kind of woke up and said to themselves, like, oh, you know what? These are people with a voice that are feeling something. And it's the first time that the Palestinians really kind of found their voice, and that the average person on the street was acting, as opposed to relying on Yasser Arafat and terrorism. It had a different feel to it. And so the First Intifada was a watershed moment for Palestinians. And that eventually led first to the Madrid Conference, and then to the Oslo Agreements. And for the first time ever, Israel recognized the PLO as kind of the foremost head of the government of the Palestinians and started doing work with them. And they in turn recognized Israel as legitimate, which was huge, right? If you remember those three no's, one of them is no peace with Israel, one of them is no recognition of Israel, and one of them is no negotiation with Israel. And you're finding that Yasser Arafat starts to do that with Shimon Peres and with Yitzhak Rabin. And the Oslo Agreement ends up happening. Now, people think the Oslo Agreement is more than it actually was. It was not necessarily a movement toward two states and peace. Instead, it was, and this is really important because it never happened, one, a recognition, two, a normalization of relationship, and three, a definition of what is Palestinian and what is Israeli within these. And they create three zones. We're in the early 90s now. What time is it? I'm still good. Okay, I wanted to do this in an hour and a half. I think I can. Three zones, A, B, and C. One of them is Palestinian. One of them is Jewish, right? So a settlement would be Jewish, Nablus would be Palestinian, or Ramallah would be Palestinian, and one of them is jointly owned, right? And they separate out those particular things so they can figure it out. The big problem is that they kick down the road the quote-unquote final status issues. And if you want to know how peace is going to be made, it's going to be made in these four ways. The final status issues for the Jewish people are, number one, security. So how are we going to keep these guys, right, these settlers safe? How are we going to make sure that no one steals water from the Jordan River, which feeds a lot of the Israel tributaries? How are we going to make sure that no one lobs weapons over into Israel? Number one is security, right? Number two is borders. What is Israel and what is going to be Palestine? And by the way, it doesn't necessarily just mean going exactly to these 67 borders. It might mean drawing the borders around a major settlement and then giving some land up here to the future Palestinian state, right? That's number two. Number three is Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, by the way, here's what the West Bank looks like right now, which is a disaster, right? The black, if you can see, are the Jewish places. The red are the Palestinian places. Most of the Jewish places are along the border, but you can see they're not all along the border. And so it's a real mess. I mean, creating two states is very difficult if you're looking for those states to be primarily Jewish or primarily Palestinian and contiguous, which really matters, right? Because you want them to be, you want to be able to drive from one place to the next, okay? But Jerusalem is huge. So first of all, what's going to happen with the old city? When even putting a mechitza in 1929 can cause one of the major Arab uprisings. And by the way, even small little things today cause major problems in the general region just by touching some of these. So we're going to talk about the second intifada in a second. That was caused by a problem in Jerusalem, right? Some of the major attacks from Gaza over the past few years have been caused by, the police kind of trying to tamp down on some unrest up there and then killing somebody up there. And it creates a whole big thing. Jerusalem is a hotbed. But the other thing is it's not as easy to just say, West Jerusalem is Jewish and East Jerusalem is Palestinian, in part because huge pockets of Jews live in East Jerusalem. And also, Jerusalem as a whole is ideologically important. If you even talk to centrist Israelis, they would tell you that they're willing to give up lots of the West Bank, but they don't want to give up East Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem is a big, big one to figure out what's going to happen to the future. And the final one is what's going to happen to the refugees. Do you give reparations? Do you let a symbolic number in? Do you let all of them in who want to come in? And so the big problem, by the way, with the refugee question is that Israel only works if 51% of Israel's population is Jewish. Otherwise, it's not a Jewish state. It's a state with lots of Jews, but it's an Arab state or a Muslim state. Right now in Israel itself, and when I say Israel proper, I mean not the West Bank, not Gaza. I'm talking about like the blue on this map right here. 75% of the population of Israel is Jewish. 20% of the population is Muslim. 5% of the population is other. It could be Thai workers, because that's a huge part of their elder care industry in Israel. It could be Christians. It could be Baha'i. But by the way, Israel is very good to its Arab minority in Israel itself, right? So when you talk about occupation and the life of Palestinians being difficult, you're talking about here and here. You're not talking about in Israel. Yes, there's racism in Israel, just like there's racism in the United States. Being a Black American is a very different experience than being a white American, right? However, the same protections are in place for both. If there's not an institutionalized something. And in Israel, although you can draw many parallels to like why it is that Arabs vote in lower numbers than Jews do for those who are, let's say, living in Tel Aviv or something like that. For the most part, the rights are exactly the same. Like it is exactly equal to be a Palestinian Arab in Israel and a Jew in Israel. That is not, by the way, the case in here. And so when people talk about occupation, they are talking here, okay? So what happens is the dream of Oslo disappears when a Jew, actually, Yigal Amir, assassinates the prime minister, Yitzhak Rabin, at a peace rally. He's just finished singing a song of peace. He comes down for the dais, he gets shot. Now, eventually, Israel tries again in the year 2000. And it's the Camp David Accords, the second Camp David Accords, and they fall apart. It doesn't work at all. And from there, right, there's an opening for a really kind of hungry political voice whose name is Ariel Sharon to walk up to the Temple Mount and to say to himself, all of this stuff is going to be ours someday. And from there comes the Second Intifada. Now, the Jews feel very betrayed. Because one, what was offered to the Palestinians in 2000 at the Camp David Accords was actually very close to almost everything they wanted. And they felt like the rug got pulled out from under them at the last minute. And that, by the way, is kind of like even the American narrative, is that Yasser Arafat pulled the rug out from under them at the last minute. Then, yes, it was incendiary for him to get up there and say that. But suddenly we've got bus bombings. We've got Sbarro's pizzas being blown up. We've got weddings being bombed. And Israel ends up actually creating a separation barrier all around here, right, at this border, which actually does work. And when they finish the separation barrier, it stops the terrorist attacks. But what it does is also, it kind of de facto creates the boundaries of Israel. And so it becomes extremely symbolically important and extremely symbolically toxic. And so, you know, Israel, for example, carved right through people's like farms and stuff like that in order to do that. Now, that brings up a really important tension that I need to talk about, which is that Israel is constantly negotiating between security and justice for Palestinians. And that is a really hard balance, right? So I'll give you an example. The way you know you are free is having freedom of movement. If I live in Nablus and I want to go to Hebron, right, I should be able to drive from Nablus to Hebron without anybody giving me a hard time if I live here. On the other hand, Israel needs to have a series of checkpoints to check and make sure that people are not bringing bombs, bringing weapons, doing something. And so if you're a Palestinian, you live under what is called occupation, which is that your life is a really challenging life. And so what's interesting is that the word occupation doesn't mean the same thing for everybody, right? The land is not occupied. And when some people say there is no occupation going on, what they're actually saying is that, like, this land was never Palestine. And the truth is, this land was never Palestine. It was Ottoman Turk, and then it was Britain, and then it was Jordan, and then it was kind of the Jews, right? And when people talk about occupation as from the left, usually what they're talking about is living a life where you have a checkpoint to get from place to place. Living a life where if you wanted to go visit family in Gaza, it would be very difficult for you to do it. Living a life where Israel could, if you have a terrorist living near your house, commandeer your house to do to do missions, to watch the terrorist activity next door before they arrested the person, right? And that is the life of Palestinians, is living under this. On the other hand, Jews are, in a way, often right in worrying about their security. And so when Israel decides in 2005, I was about to say 2004, but I stopped myself. 2005, that it was time to unilaterally disengage with Gaza, all their fears around security actually become true, right? They pull out and they say to themselves, you know what, we're actually going to hand you the keys. And this is the way that we're going to make an overture toward peace. And we're going to pull out 9,000 settlers who were living in Gaza at the time. And we're actually going to leave the infrastructure for you. There are greenhouses that were still working, that they literally gave the keys to their Palestinian neighbors and said, good luck with this, right? With the hope that this would lead toward peace. And what happens? They elect Hamas. Now, Hamas is not like overwhelmingly elected. In fact, Hamas is really sharing power with Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, who's the kind of government here. But what happens is 2 years later, Hamas ends up creating a coup where they, and I know there were kids here, but I'm going to say it anyways, where they tie the leaders of Fatah to the top of the tallest building, blindfold them, shoot them in the knees, and push them off. But that's who Hamas is, okay? And suddenly Israel is left next to a group of people who, by the way, Hamas forms after the first Intifada. And by the way, they are elected in part because they're a great social services organization. We talk about the fact that they're like stealing resources right now to build bombs. That wasn't the case before they were in power. They fed people and created hospitals, and like it makes sense why they would be voted. They weren't voted in necessarily because their charter was so appealing to Palestinians that they wanted to kill Jews. They were voted in because they were good to their people at the time. But once they get into power, that all disappears, and Israel is living under constant rocket threat. And if you look at like at this timeline, you can see anything with the word operation in it, Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, Operation Protective Edge. These are all times, and then 2001, which you may remember from a couple of years ago, it was in the spring, which actually doesn't have a name to it. Those are all the times when Hamas is sending over rocket upon rocket upon rocket to the Jewish people, and they have to end up fighting back. And Hamas is using what's called human shields. They're like hiding weapons in schools and in hospitals and not letting people leave places where armies are, so that if you kill people in the army, you're also killing civilians. This is all going on, and Hamas starts doing this very early on. But it undergirds all of the fears that Israel has over here in terms of the question about letting up on security. So if you ask the average Israeli, do you understand how Palestinians are living in the West Bank? They'll talk about it, that, you know, they get it, that it's actually a really hard thing to live under occupation here. And in the same breath, they'll point to Gaza and they'll say, we have no choice. And that's the challenge. There's this like real give and take here about making sure you've got a partner for peace that you can trust before you let up on that security thing, right? And so that's where the tension consistently falls. And that's why, having the trust for a two-state solution isn't just as simple. You have to be able to solve all four. And I actually can't tell you between refugee security, border, and Jerusalem, which one's the easiest, because they're all impossible. And so now we reach essentially today, right? And there's one more thing on your sheet that I didn't mention, which is Gilad Shalit. Israel understands, and this is why the Israel psyche is so broken right now, that parents that send their kids into war are owed something special by Israel, which means that Israel should do everything to protect their children, and that if their children are captured, they should do everything to get them back. And so Israel, over the course of time, has upped the ante more and more, so that the last major person who was taken hostage in Israel, his name is Gilad Shalit, was traded for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. And so the question of like, what is Israel willing to do to get these prisoners back is actually really challenging. And it's not unheard of that Hamas would say, clear your jails for us and we'll give you them back, because that actually is the calculus if you take the 1,000 to 1 that is right now like on the table in light of Gilad Shalit from a few years ago. So with all that said, I want to now return to a couple of the key things that you may have heard about Israel. Number one being that word occupation, right? What does occupation mean is a really important question to ask when somebody uses the word. Are they talking about the plight of the Palestinians in the West Bank? Fair. Are they talking about Israel having no right to this land at all? Not fair, right? What does occupation mean is actually a challenging thing. Number two is the question of colonialism. And by the way, these don't exist if there isn't a kernel of truth in some of these, right? Is Israel a colonialist power? Hell no. No nation is ever a colonialist power that is a native to that nation. Jews have been in Israel since Abraham first purchased land in this week's Torah portion to bury his wife Sarah in the cave of Hebron, right? However, an indigenous population returning is something to celebrate. And Israel is not all white. As we talked about, we've got that huge wave in the 1950s that came in. However, did Israel benefit from colonialism? Hell yeah, right? Had Britain not come in, had Britain not turned it over to the UN to make a partition, Israel would not exist at this point. So Israel has benefited from the early 20th century and the baggage from the early 20th century. And so I want to push strongly back on anyone who uses the word colonialist about Israel, but I do want to say that by an accident of history, colonialism has been good for the Jews. Does that make sense to everyone? Right? Now let's talk about apartheid, which you might hear on college campuses. What is apartheid? Apartheid is a group that is a minority oppressing a group that is the majority. Think about it in, South Africa, for example. There were more blacks than whites, but the blacks were kept down and the whites were allowed to vote. And so the blacks were not allowed in South Africa to have the rights that the whites did, okay? Is Israel an apartheid nation in Israel itself? No. Do Palestinians get a chance to vote in Nablus? No. And so what happens is the idea that this, which is kind of no man's land state-wise, right, ends up getting lumped together in and being told that they should have the same rights as them, is what ends up becoming the fodder for what for the claims of apartheid. I will also, by the way, say a lot of these things that are leveled against Jews, apartheid being one of them, genocide being another, colonialism being another, was actually tested in Soviet Russia as a way to attack the Jewish community. Soviets created a lot of these labels, right, and made these analogies first. They found their way into American academia, who said, oh, we really like this, and started using it, and then found its way into mainstream America. And so fascinating to think that the American left, who levels these against Israel, is actually using propaganda talking points from the Soviet Union. But Israel is not apartheid, but is in danger of being. And that's why I'm actually for a two-state solution. Because assuming Hamas is out of Gaza, and you've got a centrist government here, and you've got a pretty centrist government here in the West Bank, right? If Israel were to suddenly become all one, right? Wrap in the demographics of Gaza, the demographics of the West Bank, and the demographics of Israel, Israel is no longer 50% Jewish. And then Israel has a choice. Israel can either be Jewish or it can be democratic. It cannot be both. It can be Jewish, but it means not giving everyone a vote. It can be democratic, but one vote, one person means less than 50%, you are no longer a Jewish country. The only way to be both Jewish and democratic is to only be here and make Palestinian states where they are, okay? Now, no one knows what the future of Gaza is going to be, and really there is not a true partner for peace here. But my prayers are always that two states, because I believe in the Jewish character of Israel and know that demographically that's the only way it's going to function. And then let's talk about genocide. Where did that come from? Well, genocide has been bandied about a lot in academic circles. And sometimes there's the word cultural in front of it. Sometimes genocide is about smaller percentages of people than what the Nazis tried to do to the Jews. But the idea is, at least in academic circles, if you read their defense of the word genocide, it's anything that would destroy the future of a generation is considered a genocide, which I think, by the way, is a huge misuse of the word genocide and completely undoes the kind of legacy of what genocide means to the Jewish people. Throwing that around to the Jewish people, just like calling us Nazis, is using the greatest thing that has happened to us, greatest as in greatest ill that has happened to us, against us, which is a horrible thing to do. But that's where that's coming from on the left. And so I would say vehemence should be found in fighting that, because there is no term besides maybe Nazi that is as offensive and anti-Semitic as using that term to talk about the fact that, which by the way, has some truth to it. Hamas has ruined the next generation who live in Gaza right now, right? They're growing up in poverty. They're growing up without the education that they need. They're growing up without the hope that they need. And so the blockade that Israel has to do, right, to keep weapons out of Gaza has created a situation where people can't come and go, and where it's usually said about Gaza that Gaza is, quote unquote, the largest open air prison in the world. Now, that's not necessarily true. There are definitely parts of the statistics that would fight against that. Gaza actually has a lower infant mortality rate than the United States has, for example. When people say that, what they're talking about is the fact, and it's true, and my heart breaks for it, is that there's not a lot of hope for a Palestinian child born in Gaza right now. And so my hope is that after this war, maybe there might be a future for them. But that's what they're trying to say. And so the goal when you're dealing with people who use offensive language, who use genocide, who use colonialism, who use apartheid, honestly, who even use occupation, right? Because occupation is a loaded word too, is to ask them to describe what they mean and not use those terms. Because often you might find, if you're level-headed about it, you might actually agree with what they're saying. But the way that they say it can be so offensive, it can turn off real actual dialogue about the fact that there are two truths in Israel right now. It is really hard to be a Palestinian, and it is really scary to be a Jew. And both of those can be true at the same time, and you can figure out a way to have an honest conversation that reconciles both of those truths together. Thank you. All right, so I don't think we're necessarily going to take questions because it's late.